Welcome to Tales by Tochi. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The cold harmattan wind blew through the cracked window of the small mud-walled room as Chuka sat on the bare floor, clutching a worn-out photograph of his parents. His father had died when he was just 8, taken by a mysterious illness that swallowed their family's last hope of stability. His mother, too heartbroken to fight, followed a year later, leaving Chuka in the merciless hands of life. Before his father died, he had remarried a woman named Olama, a seemingly kind woman on the outside who transformed into something else the moment she stepped into their home. She was not his biological mother, but by tradition and law she was now responsible for him. But Olama never saw Chuka as a child to be loved. She saw him as a burden, an unwanted reminder of the man she married too late to benefit from. Her 2 children, Ibuka and Ifeanyi, treated Chuka like a stray dog that had wandered into their lives. They called him the outsider, the dead man's mistake, and worst of all, the house rat. Chuka's days were a prison sentence with no end. He woke before the first rooster crowed and was the last to lay down at night. His small, frail body was tasked with carrying buckets of water from a far stream, cleaning the house from corner to corner, cooking 3 meals daily for 5 people, and tending to the farm under the hot sun. He was often too exhausted to even cry. If a grain of rice was missing, he was beaten. If a dish was too salty, he was slapped. The bruises on his back and the calluses on his palms were the only testimonies to the life he endured. But even in the bitterness, Chuka never became bitter. He learned to smile through pain, to greet the old women at the stream with respect, to help neighbors lift firewood, and to say thank you even when handed scraps. He believed, deep in his wounded heart, that kindness was not weakness and that one day someone might return it. The villagers sometimes pitied him, but pity wasn't food, nor was it protection. When he passed by, dusty and hungry, they would whisper, "That boy's story is sad," but no one ever reached out a hand. One afternoon, Chuka was sent to the market with the last N2000 in the house. His stepmother warned him, "If you misplace this money, don't come back. You'll sleep in the gutter till rats make your bones their pillows." He held the money like it was his life. But fate, cruel as ever, wasn't done with him. Somewhere between the yam seller and the woman selling bitter leaf, he realized his pocket was empty. He froze, panic rising like bile in his throat. He turned every corner of the market upside down, tears welling in his eyes as he begged traders to help him check the ground. Please, I had money, 2,000. I need it," he stuttered, but no one had seen anything. The sun was scorching, yet his body went cold. He walked back home slowly, head bowed, hands shaking, heart pounding in fear. He had lost the only thing that stood between him and another round of brutality. When he reached the gate of the house, he stood for minutes, unable to knock. He knew what waited inside, not just a beating but rejection. And he was right. The moment his stepmother opened the door and saw his empty hands, she didn't wait for an explanation. With fire in her eyes and venom in her voice, she screamed, "Get out! You good for nothing. I knew you'd disgrace me. Don't come back until you bring that money." Then she slammed the door, and the sound echoed like thunder in Chuka's chest. Chuka had long known hunger, but that day hunger tasted like betrayal and heartbreak. As the dust from his stepmother's slammed door settled in the air behind him, he stood like a broken statue, not knowing where to turn. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the red earth road, and with every step he took away from the only home he had ever known, even if it never felt like one, his heart grew heavier. He thought about running to the homes of distant relatives, but most had cut ties with his family after his father's death. They saw Olama for what she truly was, and by extension wanted nothing to do with anything tied to her. With nowhere else to go, Chuka found an abandoned wooden bench beside a quiet bush path and sat, his stomach rumbling violently. The world passed him by, traders returning from the market, children chasing tires in the dust, and no one noticed the boy who once fetched water for nearly every house in the village. His kindness, it seemed, had not bought him favor, only forgetfulness. As night fell, the sky turned a melancholic shade of blue, and the air grew cold. Mosquitoes buzzed mercilessly around Chuka's ears, and his dry lips cracked with thirst. Yet, his mind replayed every moment of suffering he had endured in that house. At just 10 years old, Olama had forced him to wake at 4 a.m. daily. While Ibuka and Ifeanyi remained curled in warm beds, Chuka would sweep the compound, fetch water from the stream in the dark, and return in time to cook breakfast. Many days he cooked meals he was not allowed to eat. If food remained, he was given the burnt portion or the smallest scraps. If he dared to complain or say he was tired, Olama would hiss, "Is this not the reason I kept you? If not for your father's stubbornness, I would have let you rot in the street." Even during holidays when other children played and laughed, Chuka was in the farm, carrying loads thrice his weight. He never received gifts, never wore new clothes, he was merely the house boy who bore their name. Yet in all this, Chuka never allowed his heart to become poisoned. When Ibuka broke a neighbor's window, Chuka took the blame to protect him. When Ifyananya stole money from a trader's tray, it was Chuka who was whipped and paraded as a thief. And still, he helped old women carry their baskets, ran errands for teachers after school, and greeted everyone with respect. People often wondered why he smiled so much despite the obvious pain in his eyes. But Chuka believed that if he allowed hatred in, he would become no better than those who hurt him. He dreamed silently, dreams of building a future where no one would ever suffer as he did. But that night, alone, starving and shivering on a wooden bench, even his dreams felt far away. He curled himself into a ball and whispered into the cold night air, "God, are you still watching?" By morning, Chuka's lips were white, and his stomach had begun to spasm from emptiness. The ache wasn't new, he'd slept hungry many times before, but this time, there was no promise of tomorrow. There was no pot on a stove where he could sneak a spoonful of leftover soup or gari to mix with water. There was no floor to sleep on anymore, no corner to hide from the world. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled. The tears came silently, not the dramatic sobs of a child seeking pity, but the slow, aching kind that streamed down without permission, the kind that a soul cries when it feels utterly forgotten. As he sat on the side of the road near the local market, dust swirling around him, people passed and glanced, then moved on. Some recognized him and whispered, "Isn't that Olama's boy?" But none stopped to help. He was invisible, worse than invisible. He was a laughingstock, a lost cause. Children giggled and pointed. A trader scolded him for sitting too close to her stall, calling him a dirty distraction. Just when he thought the earth might swallow him in shame, a small shadow blocked the sun from his eyes. He looked up, blinking through tears, and saw the figure of a young woman, short in height, her head barely reaching his shoulders even as he sat on the ground. She wore a simple Ankara dress, faded at the edges but neatly pressed, and her eyes, oh her eyes, were full of something he hadn't seen in days, kindness. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, crouching beside him. Chuka tried to speak, but his voice cracked. I lost money, and they chased me out." She didn't laugh, didn't step away in disgust. Instead, she pulled out a handkerchief and offered it to him. "I'm Mimi," she said softly. "You look like you need a friend." Chuka nodded slowly. He hadn't heard such calmness in a voice in so long, it felt like a song. Mimi sat beside him, and for the next half hour she listened, not interrupting, not judging, just listening. Mimi then stood up and offered him her hand. "Come with me," she said. Chuka hesitated. "I have nowhere to go." She smiled gently. "Then I'll take you somewhere you're not laughed at." They walked through the dusty path together, an unlikely pair, a tall, frail boy and a beautiful dwarf, gathering stares and whispers from everyone they passed. Some laughed loudly. One teenage boy even shouted, "See this hungry boy with a midget. Hunger don finish am." But Chuka didn't care anymore, and neither did Mimi. She held her head high, and her stride, though shorter, carried the dignity of someone who knew their worth. For the first time in days, Chuka didn't feel like garbage. He felt human. He didn't know who this girl truly was or why she had chosen to stop for him, but deep in his soul, he felt like his prayer in the night had been answered. When Mimi led Chuka to a small compound tucked quietly behind the market square, it was nothing like he expected. The building wasn't grand, but it was clean and peaceful, with a small garden, 2 wooden chairs at the front, and a dog wagging its tail excitedly. It turned out to be her cousin's house, where she had been staying for a few weeks. "I don't stay long anywhere," she explained as she handed him a plate of hot jollof rice and fried plantain. "People tend to laugh too much when they find out who I am, or they treat me like a joke." Chuka took the food with trembling hands, trying not to eat too fast but failing. His stomach groaned as the first spoonful hit. Tears fell again, this time from gratitude. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Mimi's eyes shimmered. "Because I know what it feels like to be seen as nothing." "But you're not nothing, Chuka." That night, Chuka slept on a real mattress for the first time in weeks. He didn't wake up to shouting. No one kicked his feet to wake him up before dawn. He wasn't forced to lift buckets or cook food he wouldn't taste. When he opened his eyes, there was sunlight and silence. And there was Mimi sitting by the window reading a book. She smiled when she saw him awake. Sleep well? She asked. Chuka nodded. Better than I have in years. Over the next few days they became inseparable. Mimi took him with her to places she visited. A library in town, the park, even a small village school where she once volunteered to read to the children. Every time people stared or whispered about her, Chuka stood by her side, unbothered. And every time people mocked him for being with a dwarf, Mimi smiled and held his hand tighter. They were kindred spirits, wounded differently but healing together. One evening, as they walked home from the market, Mimi paused beneath a jacaranda tree and said something that made Chuka stop breathing for a second. I'm the only daughter of Chief Okonkwo, she said. The billionaire that owns Okonkwo Group, the oil company, the estates, the hospitals, the hotels, all of it. Chuka blinked, stunned. Why are you here like this? Mimi sighed. Because no one believes me. The last time I told someone they laughed for an hour and called me mad. They think a dwarf can't be a billionaire's daughter. So I stopped telling people, except you. Chuka didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He simply looked at her and said, I believe you. And with that, something shifted. In a world where both had been mocked, discarded, and denied dignity, they had found each other, and that was the beginning of everything. Chuka knew the peace he found with Mimi couldn't last forever without consequences. Though his heart was growing full with the companionship he never thought he deserved, his mind still echoed with the sharp voice of his stepmother and the bruises etched into memory by her cruelty. He hadn't seen her face since the day she threw him out, and he wasn't eager to, but a part of him longed for closure, or perhaps justice. Mimi, ever gentle, suggested they return together to confront her, not for vengeance but to offer her the money she gave Chuka, to prove he wasn't a thief or liar. Chuka hesitated but eventually agreed. As they approached the compound, the dusty road stretched endlessly, the same road where he had often walked barefoot carrying heavy buckets in shame. But now he wasn't alone. He walked beside a friend, someone who saw value in him even when he doubted it himself. Mimi wore her brightest wrapper, tied firmly around her small waist, and held her head high. She knew what awaited them, yet she carried herself like royalty. As soon as they entered the compound, laughter exploded like thunder. Ifyananya was the first to spot them through the window and shouted, Come and see, oh! Hunger has made Chuka mad. He has gone to marry a dwarf. Olama stormed out of the house, her wrapper tied in haste, fury burning in her eyes. But when she saw Mimi, her anger quickly turned to mockery. So this is what you went to fetch after losing my money? This small thing? This toy of a human being? Her voice was cruel and loud enough for neighbors to hear. Ibuka joined in, clapping his hands and laughing till tears rolled down his cheeks. You finally found your match, Chuka. Both of you belong in the circus. The abuse rained down like a storm. Mimi stood still, trying to maintain her composure, but Chuka's fists were clenched. He took a step forward and tried to speak, but Olama threw a sachet of water at him, soaking his shirt. Get out of here with your Lilliputian girlfriend, she screamed. Mimi, in a calm yet firm voice, took a step forward. I am Mimi Okonkwo, she said. Daughter of Chief Magnus Okonkwo, the billionaire. A silence fell for 2 seconds, then burst into more laughter, louder, harsher, more humiliating than before. You? Olama said between cackles. You, this small thing that looks like a misplaced puppet? Do you think we are fools? If you like, say you are the president's wife, I won't even believe it. The more Mimi tried to explain, the more they laughed. If you're a billionaire's daughter, then I'm the Queen of England. Ibuka joked. The humiliation was unbearable. Chuka stood beside her, and even though every insult stabbed at his soul, he didn't leave her side. He held her hand, whispering, Ignore them. You know who you are. And that moment, that touch, became a silent vow between them. They were no longer going to prove themselves to those who chose not to see. They walked away hand in hand, two mocked souls with dignity that couldn't be broken. Chuka barely spoke on the walk back. The sun had set, and a bitter wind now swept through the street as if nature itself disapproved of the cruelty they had faced. Mimi, despite everything, smiled. It wasn't the bright, cheerful smile she had worn earlier in the day, but a quiet, knowing one, the kind that said, I'm used to this. She gently rubbed Chuka's hand and said, You don't have to fight for me, Chuka. I've been laughed at since I was a child. But today someone stood beside me. That means more than anything. Chuka looked at her and felt a pain deeper than hunger. The pain of injustice, of witnessing a beautiful soul reduced to a joke by people too blind to see value. No one should treat you like that, he whispered. Mimi nodded. But they always do. Except you. That night, as they sat under the same mango tree where they first bonded, they made a decision to no longer seek acceptance from those who delighted in their pain. The days that followed brought whispers around the village. Word had spread fast about Chuka's tiny girlfriend, who claimed to be the daughter of a billionaire. The laughter reached new heights. In the local bar, drunk men cracked jokes about how Chuka would need to carry his wife in his pocket. Women giggled loudly at the market, saying things like, "Maybe she hides her wealth in a matchbox." The worst part wasn't the mockery, it was the isolation. No one wanted to associate with Chuka anymore. He was now that foolish boy who believed a dwarf. Traders refused to sell to him unless he paid double. Children threw stones at him, calling him midget lover. Even the landlord of Mimi's cousin grew uncomfortable and hinted they should leave. It was the darkest season of their journey, yet it was also the one that solidified their bond. Every insult pushed them closer. Every rejection reminded them of the world's blindness and their shared strength. Then one afternoon, as the two sat together outside a quiet church, Mimi turned to Chuka and asked, "Would you marry me?" Chuka was stunned. He had never imagined himself worthy of her, and here she was, asking the question. "You're asking me?" he breathed. She smiled. "Yes. I want to spend my life with someone who sees me. Who doesn't care about how short I am or how the world laughs at me. I want someone who knows pain but chooses kindness anyway." Chuka didn't need time to think. He said yes with a heart full of trembling gratitude. They knew what their wedding would look like. They knew it would be a carnival of shame in the eyes of many. But they also knew they weren't doing it for the world. They were doing it for themselves, two hearts that had been trampled on, finally choosing joy. They began planning immediately, determined to make it special. Not grand, not flashy, but sacred. They were unaware, however, that the wedding would become the stage upon which their humiliation would turn to awe, and the story would take a twist no one saw coming. Word of their engagement spread like wildfire, not because people were happy for them, but because they were hungry for drama. "Did you hear? That foolish boy and the dwarf girl are planning a wedding." Olama laughed so hard when she heard the news, she almost choked on her food. "We must attend," she declared with wicked delight. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Ibuka and Ifeanyi joked about buying popcorn and soft drinks to enjoy the circus. They even created a group chat named The Wedding of the Century, Chuka and Midget. Invitations weren't necessary. The village was already buzzing with excitement, not to celebrate love, but to feast on mockery. Chuka knew what was coming. Mimi, too, expected the humiliation. Yet they pressed on. Together, they sewed modest clothes for the day, invited a humble pastor from a nearby village and rented plastic chairs. They didn't have money for decoration or music, but they had love. That was enough for them. 2 days before the wedding, they returned to the same mango tree where they first sat together. "This place saved my life," Chuka said. "It gave me you." Mimi smiled as she leaned her head on his shoulder. "And it gave me you, the only man who didn't flinch when I said I'm the daughter of a billionaire." Chuka chuckled. "Maybe I'm the only one foolish enough to believe it." Mimi looked into his eyes seriously. "You're not foolish. You have something most people lost, faith." She paused. "But Chuka, this time, they'll all see. I won't hide anymore." She didn't explain what she meant and Chuka didn't press. He assumed she was just tired of pretending. But Mimi had made a call to her parents, one that would turn everything upside down. On the morning of the wedding, as Mimi got dressed in a borrowed lace gown and Chuka straightened his cheap trousers, the compound filled with neighbors laughing in anticipation. Children made jokes about whether the pastor would need to stand on a stool to bless Mimi. Olama came dressed like she was attending a comedy show, whispering insults into every guest's ear. And then, just as the pastor asked everyone to rise for the bride's entrance, the sound of multiple car horns filled the air. Heads turned. People gasped. A convoy of black SUVs, flanked by armed security and 2 luxury limousines, pulled into the compound. The laughter died instantly. And from the last car stepped out a regal man in Igbata and a woman dressed in gold, Chief Magnus Okonkwo and his wife. Behind them walked Mimi, radiant, beautiful and proud, no longer just the dwarf girl they mocked, but the billionaire's only daughter. And in that moment, every mocking voice turned to silence, and every sneer froze mid-laugh. The air at the wedding froze. People who had come to laugh now stood with their jaws hanging open. The convoy that had arrived was unlike anything the village had seen before. The black SUVs glistened under the sun, each with tinted windows and chrome trims that sparkled like diamonds. Bodyguards in suits and dark shades scanned the crowd as Chief Magnus Okonkwo stepped forward. His presence alone silenced even the boldest mouths. Whispers rippled through the gathering like wildfire. Is that really Chief Okonkwo? Someone asked. He owns the oil fields near Abuja, another murmured. The chief didn't smile. He walked with regal confidence straight to the altar where Chuka stood in disbelief, and where Mimi, now dressed in a breathtaking designer wedding gown, stood like royalty. He took the microphone and said, "Today my only daughter marries the man who saw her worth when the world did not. The man who believed her when even his own family laughed. Today that man becomes my son." But despite the sudden respect that began to spread, not everyone was quick to accept what was happening. Olama pushed her way to the front, her wrapper now dragging on the floor. "No, no, no," she shouted. "It's a trick. This girl is not your daughter, Chief. She's a liar. She came to my house with this useless boy pretending to be rich." She turned to the guests. "Don't believe them. It's a scam." The chief raised his hand to silence the crowd. "You must be the stepmother," he said, his voice calm but dangerous. "You are the one who beat and starved the boy who now stands before you. You are the one who laughed at my daughter when she said who she was." Olama faltered, eyes darting as she stammered. I didn't know. I thought she was just one of those." But the damage was done. The crowd that had laughed at Chuka now began whispering about Olama's cruelty. Some shook their heads. Others looked away in shame. And Mimi, standing tall despite her stature, turned to the crowd. "I told you who I was," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You laughed. You spat. You cursed. And still this man believed me. That's why I chose him." It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had become a reckoning. Chief Okonkwo ordered his personal guards to escort his daughter and Chuka into a specially decorated stretch limousine. Gifts flowed in from every corner, properties, business shares and startup capital, all handed to Chuka in front of the same villagers who had once called him worthless. Olama tried again to step forward, her hands trembling, eyes wide with panic. "Please forgive me. I didn't know," she pleaded. But Chuka didn't say a word. He looked at her with the same eyes she had ignored all those years, eyes full of pain, not hate. Then he turned away. As the car drove off, leaving dust and shame behind, the villagers stood in stunned silence. Some cried. Some tried to cover their faces. Others simply stood still, unable to process what had just happened. The boy they had mocked had become the son-in-law of the most powerful man they knew. And the girl they called a joke had become a queen before their eyes. Weeks after the wedding, the story of Chuka and Mimi spread like wildfire, not just across the village but throughout the state and even parts of the country. Newspapers picked up headlines like "Dwarf Heiress Marries Orphan from the Streets," and "Billionaire's Daughter Weds Humble Soul Who Believed in Her." Social media exploded with videos and photos from the wedding, taken by nosy guests who had once come to mock. The same people who recorded the ceremony with the intention of turning it into comedy now watched in horror as their videos were used by blogs and magazines to celebrate the love story of the year. Chuka and Mimi, once dismissed as nobodies, had become a symbol of love without prejudice, of dignity in suffering, of victory after humiliation. But for Chuka it was more than a headline. It was redemption. For the first time in his life he slept in a bed with silk sheets, ate food he didn't have to cook, and was called sir by staff members who bowed whenever he passed. But none of it made him proud. If anything, it humbled him more. Because he remembered the floor he used to sleep on. He remembered the cane, the slaps, the hunger. Meanwhile, Olama's house had become a shell of noise and confusion. Neighbors who once gossiped with her now kept their distance. Traders who used to give her credit now demanded cash up front. Ibuka and Ifeanyi were ridiculed at every turn. "So you people chased away the billionaire's son-in-law?" someone would shout at the market. God punished poverty of sense. Even relatives who once visited frequently now pretended not to know them. Olama sat in her living room most days, staring at the wall, clutching the last photograph she had of Chuka as a boy, the one she used to roll her eyes at whenever she cleaned. Now, it was her only link to the boy who had become greater than her wildest imagination. One evening, she gathered the courage to send a message to Mimi through a local pastor. "Please tell her I'm sorry. Tell Chuka he can come home, I'll cook his favorite soup." The message never received a reply. At the new mansion gifted by Chief Okonkwo, Mimi and Chuka lived quietly and simply. Despite the wealth around them, they didn't rush to change who they were. Chuka still woke early, still offered to help the staff, and still greeted everyone with a warm smile. Mimi continued her charity work for persons with disabilities, using her influence to speak for those who were often ridiculed like her. But one night, over dinner, Mimi reached across the table and said, You know, when I proposed to you I thought you'd laugh. Chuka raised an eyebrow. Why? Because everyone else had laughed at me for everything. My height, my dreams, even my voice. I thought you'd laugh too. Chuka reached for her hand and smiled. You were the only one who ever saw me. How could I laugh at someone who saved my life? They sat in silence for a while, holding hands, not because they needed to speak but because sometimes the deepest love is found in shared silence. It wasn't enough for Olama and her children to stew in regret. They were desperate to rewrite the story. They began spreading a new version of events, that Chuka had used juju to deceive the billionaire's daughter. How can a boy who used to eat lizard soup become a millionaire overnight? Ibuka cried at a bar one evening. It's not natural. It must be charms. Ifeanyi joined him, adding, or maybe she's not really his wife. Maybe it's just for show. But no one believed them. The evidence of Mimi's love and Chuka's transformation was too clear. Even in their attempts to soil his name, they only dug their own graves deeper. One night, Olama sat outside her crumbling house, tears streaming down her face. God, how did I not see it? How did I not know he was special? But the question remained unanswered, just like the many calls she placed to Mimi's personal assistant that never rang through. Despite the chaos outside their new world, Mimi and Chuka began preparing for a community outreach event in the same village where they had been mocked. They decided to host a medical outreach, food distribution, and educational seminar under the foundation Mimi had now registered in her name. It was Mimi's idea to invite everyone, even the ones who had mocked them. Let them come, she said. Let them see who we are. Not for revenge but to teach them. Chuka was hesitant at first. What if they mock us again? He asked. Mimi smiled. They won't. Not this time. Now they know the truth. Invitations were sent. Some tore them up. Some hid them in shame. But many, most, came. Hunger and curiosity are powerful motivators. And so, on the day of the outreach, the same village square where Chuka was once chased with stones now held canopies, food stands, medical tents, and a massive banner that read, Okonkwo Foundation, Dignity for All. Chuka and Mimi arrived not in convoy this time, but hand in hand, dressed modestly, smiling at everyone. Children ran toward them with joy, not stones. Adults bowed, not sneered. And even Olama, standing far at the back, dressed in the same faded wrapper from Chuka's wedding, wept quietly. She wanted to run forward, fall on her knees and scream apologies. But the crowd stood between them like a wall. Chuka saw her. Their eyes met. And then he looked away. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't vengeance. It was simply peace. The kind that comes when you no longer need anything from the people who once crushed your soul. The wedding may have ended, but the ripples it created continued to disturb the still waters of every conversation across the village. Some still whispered about it in awe, others in disbelief and a few in jealousy. But before that incredible day, long before the convoy arrived or the billionaire's voice silenced the mockers, the setup had been cruel and humiliating. Days leading up to the wedding had been nothing short of emotional torture for Chuka and Mimi. The wedding invitation had been passed around more as a source of entertainment than celebration. Come and witness the wedding between the village slave and the pocket-sized bride. One flyer mockingly read, crafted secretly by Ibuka and spread all over the neighborhood. Children practiced chants like, short bride, hungry groom, and adults looked forward to the day as if it were a comedy festival. Chuka overheard someone at the market saying they would bring their mat to lie down and laugh properly. Olama had not only agreed to the wedding but had taken it upon herself to plan certain aspects. She volunteered her compound as the venue, not out of kindness but because she wanted to make sure every second of the humiliation was captured and remembered. Let's decorate with balloons and write, happily ever after with Hobbit bride on the wall, she had said during a meeting with her daughter and some gossip-loving neighbors. Ifeanyi giggled so hard she nearly fell off her chair. And let's put a stool by the altar so she can reach the microphone. To them it was all a circus, an event to immortalize Chuka's fall from grace, not knowing that fate was already preparing a divine reversal. Mimi was fully aware of what was happening behind the scenes. She heard the whispers, read the cruel flyers, and even saw a video online where a man impersonated Chuka and acted out a skit about marrying a dwarf. She saved that video on her phone, not to get angry but to remember. The world is a classroom, she once told Chuka, and cruelty is often the loudest student. But love is the one who listens. On the morning of the wedding, Olama made sure that Mimi and Chuka had no illusions. I hope you know you'll be laughed at today, she told Chuka with a smirk. I hope you're strong enough not to cry in front of everyone. She didn't even bother hiding her disdain. Guests started arriving as early as 8 a.m., many of them not even dressed formally. Some wore jeans and slippers, others brought camp chairs and snacks. The mocking laughter began the moment Mimi stepped out of the rented dressing room, her small frame swallowed in a gown clearly not designed for her stature. "Jesus, is this a wedding or a school play?" one woman whispered. Someone else chuckled. "She looks like a little girl pretending to be a bride." Through all of it, Chuka stood still, eyes burning but unblinking. He took her hand, kissed it, and whispered, "Today I marry the most beautiful woman in the world." And that moment, caught on camera, would later go viral, but not for the reasons the mockers expected. Just as the pastor cleared his throat to begin the ceremony, a sudden sound shattered the air, deep, thunderous honks followed by screeching tires and the steady thump of polished shoes hitting earth. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Mouths hung open. It was a scene no one could have imagined in their wildest dreams. One after the other, glossy black SUVs rolled into the compound, all bearing diplomatic plates. Behind them came a stretch limousine longer than any vehicle the village had ever seen. Uniformed security officers leapt out and lined the perimeter. For a split second, the entire place went dead silent. The same crowd that had laughed mere minutes ago now watched in stunned awe. And then he stepped out, Chief Magnus Okonkwo himself, the man whose name was spoken only with reverence and awe in the state. Dressed in a royal blue agbada, a gold staff in hand, and flanked by elite guards, he stood like a king walking into a forgotten palace. Whispers exploded like wildfire. "My God, that's really him. What's he doing here? Wait, didn't the dwarf bride say she was his daughter?" So, it was true? But the loudest silence came from Olama. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Her wrapper began to slip from her waist and she clutched it, trembling. Ibuka's lips quivered, and Ifyananya broke into tears on the spot. As Chief Okonkwo approached the altar, the pastor, visibly shaking, took a step back. Mimi stepped forward, her eyes locked with her father's. "Daddy," she said simply, and he embraced her tightly. The chief turned to face the stunned crowd. "This is my only daughter," he declared. "And this is her husband, a man not chosen for wealth but for heart. A man who stood by her when the world mocked her." He raised Chuka's hand and continued, "This is now my son." Gasps filled the air. Some tried to clap. Others couldn't even move. The joke had become a miracle before their eyes. The entire event shifted. The same people who came with mockery now tried to blend into the background. Phones came out, this time not to laugh but to record proof that they were witnesses to history. The pastor stammered his way through the ceremony, forgetting parts of his script. The once laughing guests now fell over themselves trying to take photos with the couple. After the ceremony, Chief Okonkwo invited everyone to a surprise reception at the most luxurious event center in the capital city, all expenses paid. A fleet of luxury buses waited outside the village to transport the guests. As the crowd dispersed, Olama tried to rush to Chuka, calling out his name, but the guards blocked her. "Please, my son," she begged. "Please forgive me." Chuka turned, looked her in the eyes, and then walked into the limo holding Mimi's hand. No anger. No smile. Just silence. It was the loudest answer he could ever give her. The reception was like something out of a movie. Giant crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, flowers imported from South Africa adorned the tables, and guests were served meals they couldn't even pronounce. It was no longer a wedding, it was a coronation. Mimi, the girl they mocked, now sat on a throne-like chair beside Chuka, radiant in a second gown tailored to her frame by a top designer. Chuka wore a bespoke tuxedo gifted by Chief Okonkwo himself. The media had arrived in full force. Drones hovered overhead, and microphones were passed around by reporters eager to cover the couple's fairy tale love story. As Chuka addressed the audience with humble gratitude, he made sure to say, "I was once the boy who swept compounds and begged for Gary. I was once the one no one saw. But one person saw me, she's sitting beside me now. And because she believed in me, I now believe anything is possible." Thunderous applause followed. But not everyone clapped. Seated at the back were Ibuka and Ifyananya, their heads bowed in shame. They had been dragged along by the crowd, too embarrassed to be there yet too afraid to stay behind. Olama, however, was not present. She had collapsed after the convoy left the village and was taken home by neighbors. Her children sat in silence, ignored by everyone. A few brave guests approached them with fake smiles, but it was clear they were now the ones being pitted. The reversal was poetic. The slaves of the story had become kings. The kings of mockery had become footnotes. It was a transformation so powerful, it left even the most hardened skeptics speechless. And as Mimi stood to speak, her voice strong and graceful, she said, "To every child who has ever been mocked, to every woman who has been judged by her appearance, and to every man who has been told he is not enough, let our love be your answer." That night, as fireworks lit up the sky, Mimi and Chuka danced slowly, their arms wrapped around each other, oblivious to the cameras flashing and the world watching. They had walked through fire, held hands through storm, and come out wrapped in grace. Chuka whispered into her ear, "You were never small to me." Mimi smiled through her tears and replied, "And you were always bigger than they could ever imagine." In that moment, the laughter of the past dissolved into the music of their joy. Their story had just begun, not with riches but with courage. Not with beauty but with belief. And not with acceptance from the world but with love that defied it. Back in the village, the silence in Olama's compound was loud. Her once vibrant home, the center of gossip and cruelty, had become a shadow of itself. Days after the wedding, she sat motionless on the same bench where she had laughed at Chuka and Mimi. Her neighbors no longer visited, and her children barely spoke. The shame was too much for them to carry. What once gave them joy, mocking Chuka, had turned into a never-ending nightmare. Olama could barely eat. Every meal reminded her of the day she denied him food, mocked his tears, and tossed him into the street like trash. She watched, day after day, as images of the grand wedding and reception flooded social media. There was her face, frozen in mid-laugh, in one video that had now gone viral. The stepmother who mocked a billionaire's daughter. That was her new title. She had become the villain of a real-life fairy tale, and the shame gnawed at her soul. She tried everything she could think of to make contact with Chuka. She went to the local church and asked the pastor to pray for her lost son. She wrote letters she had no address for, sobbing as she folded them. "I'm sorry, Chuka," one read. "I didn't know your worth. I was blinded by ignorance and pride." She sent word through neighbors who had stopped speaking to her. She even tried bribing a commercial driver to take her to the Okonkwo mansion in the city, but the man looked at her and said, "Even if you pay double, I won't take you to embarrass yourself again." The children at the stream now mocked her. "Mama Midget's enemy," they called her, laughing as they threw pebbles into the water. Her own son Ibuka, once boastful and arrogant, could barely step out of the house without hearing, "So you drove a prince out of the palace?" Olama, now broken and lonely, wept most nights, but her tears, unlike Chuka's, found no comfort, no arms around her, no one who believed she could change. Despite all of this, Chuka remained silent. He had seen her face at the wedding, and though he didn't speak, the weight of his silence echoed louder than any insult. It wasn't that he wanted revenge, he just didn't want her anywhere near his healing. He had lived a life of neglect and pain, and now that joy had finally found him, he wasn't going to allow the ghosts of his past to steal his peace. Mimi didn't push him to forgive her either. She simply held his hand and told him, "Forgiveness doesn't always mean return. Sometimes it just means freedom, for you, not them." And Chuka understood that perfectly. He didn't hate his stepmother. He simply no longer needed her in his life. He was finally free. And freedom, when earned through suffering, is too precious to gamble with pity. As days turned into weeks, Chuka and Mimi's story became a phenomenon far beyond the walls of their new mansion. Influential blogs, newspapers, and television stations picked up the story. The Dwarf They Laughed At became the title of a trending documentary that chronicled their journey, from rejection to royalty. Interviews flooded in. Mimi, always eloquent and graceful, sat on national television and told the world about the day she met Chuka under a mango tree. "I saw him crying," she said, her voice trembling. "And I knew he wasn't crying for himself, but because he believed no one would ever see him as more than a poor orphan. I had felt that same way my whole life." The host asked her how she endured the mockery, and she replied, "When your heart is used to pain, laughter doesn't break you. What breaks you is silence, the kind that makes you invisible." But Chuka made me feel seen. Chuka too was interviewed, though less often. When he did speak, he spoke gently but firmly. "My story isn't just mine. It belongs to every boy who was told he's not enough. It belongs to every girl who was mocked for how she looks. What saved me was love, the real kind, not the one that needs permission or applause." His humility stunned audiences. Here was a man who had inherited wealth overnight, yet still spoke like the boy who once fetched water barefoot. The public was moved. Thousands of letters poured in. Couples from all over sent gifts. Young people sent thank you notes. Activists reached out to work with Mimi's new foundation, which she named Worthy Beyond Measure. Its mission: to protect, elevate, and empower people with physical differences and those marginalized by society. From pain they birthed a purpose and the world took notice. But the reactions weren't all positive. Some were bitter. There were people, small-minded and cold-hearted, who couldn't accept the couple's rise. They accused Mimi of using her father's influence for pity. Others spread rumors that Chuka married her for money. These voices, though loud in small corners, never reached the hearts of the couple. "They still don't get it," Mimi said one day as she and Chuka walked through the garden of their estate. "They think we're a headline. But we're a heartbeat." Chuka smiled. "Let them talk. They don't know what it means to cry yourself to sleep and still wake up smiling. That's our strength." And so, while the world debated their worth, they continued living, not for the camera, not for approval, but for each other, for the peace they fought to earn, and for the joy that only love born in the fire can truly understand. In the months that followed, Chuka and Mimi settled into their new life with quiet elegance. They didn't flaunt their wealth or chase luxury. Instead, they focused on each other, learning to heal from wounds that fame could never erase. Mimi insisted on maintaining some of their old routines, cooking together, taking evening walks, even visiting local markets dressed like ordinary people. On one such trip, a little girl ran up to Mimi and asked, "Are you the lady on TV?" Mimi smiled and knelt gently. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl hugged her tightly and whispered, "You're beautiful." Mimi held back tears. That simple phrase, "You're beautiful," had been denied her for most of her life. It reminded her of the first time Chuka called her beautiful, not because of her wealth or name but because of who she was. Their love deepened. Chuka often stared at Mimi with the same awe he had the day they met. He loved her strength, how she turned every insult into armor, how she stood tall even when her body was small. And Mimi loved his gentleness, how he still offered to carry groceries, still listened when she spoke, still kissed her forehead every night before bed. One evening, while watching the stars from their balcony, Chuka said, "You gave me something I never had, not wealth, not status, but peace. You made me feel like I belong." Mimi looked into his eyes and replied, "And you made me feel tall in a world that always looked down on me." Their words weren't poetry. They were truth, raw and sacred. It was a love story not written in fairy tales, but in scars and survival. Mimi soon became a speaker at international conferences, while Chuka focused on managing businesses gifted to him by Chief Okonkwo. But no matter how far they traveled or how many accolades they received, they never stopped returning to that mango tree. It became a sacred space, a reminder of beginnings, of hope, of silent prayers answered. One day Chuka carved into the tree, "Where they laughed we rose." The engraving stayed there, bold and clear, so that anyone who passed could read it. And every time a child was mocked for their size, or a man told he was useless, or a woman laughed at for being different, they would hear about Mimi and Chuka. They would hear about the dwarf they laughed at, and the orphan they called a mistake. And they would know, your worth isn't what they say. Your worth is what you carry inside, waiting to bloom. When Chuka and Mimi discovered they were expecting a child, it was like the final piece in their puzzle of healing. For Mimi, the news came with a mixture of joy and anxiety. From the moment she confirmed the pregnancy, doctors began monitoring her closely, concerned about how her stature might affect the process. Every appointment came with cautious smiles from the medical team and whispered warnings about high-risk factors. But through it all, Mimi remained brave. She often placed Chuka's hand on her belly at night and whispered, "They said I'd never be worthy of love. Now I carry proof that love doesn't need permission." Chuka, more emotional than ever, took it upon himself to be by her side at every stage. He read pregnancy books aloud, cooked her favorite meals, and built the baby's nursery with his own hands. "Our child will grow up knowing that their parents faced the world, and won," he said one evening as they painted the nursery walls a warm golden yellow. The media caught wind of the pregnancy, and it quickly became a trending topic. "Will the baby be a dwarf?" was the insensitive question asked across gossip blogs and comment sections. Mimi refused to engage in such speculation. "Whatever our child is," she stated in an interview, "they'll be loved. And that's what matters." The couple focused instead on preparing their hearts and home for the arrival of their little one. When the time came, Mimi was admitted into the best maternity hospital in the country. Even Chief Okonkwo, ever the composed mogul, paced nervously outside the delivery room. Hours passed before the cries of a baby echoed down the hospital corridor. Chuka rushed in, tears streaming down his face as he saw his wife cradling their newborn son, perfectly formed, healthy, and to everyone's surprise of average height. "He's beautiful," Mimi whispered. "Just like his father." The doctor smiled and said everything looked great. There were no signs of dwarfism or any complications. But for Chuka and Mimi, that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that he had arrived safely, a child born not of pity or convenience but of real, undiluted love. The child was named Zikora, meaning show the world. And indeed, from the day of his birth, he became a symbol. The public responded with overwhelming positivity. Newspapers called him the miracle child, while advocacy groups praised Chuka and Mimi for redefining the public's view on love, stature, and success. Yet, amidst all the fame and fascination, the couple made a deliberate decision. Zikora would grow up shielded from the noise. They wanted him to know the value of humility, the strength in kindness, and the story behind his name. Mimi would rock him gently and tell him, "You are the fruit of pain that turned to purpose. You are the dream that survived laughter, mockery, and rejection. Your name is not just yours, it is every child's who was ever made to feel less." And as Zikora slept peacefully, wrapped in warmth and surrounded by love, the world outside slowly began to change, inspired by the legacy of the boy from the streets and the dwarf they laughed at. As the Okonkwo household flourished with new life and deeper love, back in the village, the shadows of past deeds began to settle like heavy dust upon those who had once lifted their voices in ridicule. Olama's home, once filled with laughter, though bitter and cruel, now echoed only with regret and silence. The decline had been rapid. With her reputation destroyed, she lost the little trade she had maintained. Customers stopped buying from her market stall, and whispers followed her wherever she went. "Isn't she the one who beat that billionaire's son?" they would say. Imagine chasing away your own blessing. Her shame was not just public, it was suffocating. Her children, Ibuka and Ifyinanya, fared no better. Both had dropped out of school due to lack of funds. Relatives who once visited for food and favors now ignored their calls. Some even blocked them, ashamed to be associated with the family that mocked and abused greatness. Ibuka, who once paraded himself as the real son of the house, now worked as a bike rider, ferrying passengers who chuckled behind his back. One day he picked up two teenagers who didn't recognize him. As they rode, they gossiped about Chuka, praising his rise and condemning the stepfamily who had treated him like trash. "That family is cursed," one of them said. "God really punished them." Ibuka dropped them off in silence, his hands trembling on the bike handles. Ifyinanya, who had once boasted of her beauty and class, now sold tomatoes by the roadside, her skin darkened by the sun and her smile long gone. She often caught herself watching videos of Chuka and Mimi's charity work on her neighbor's phone and crying silently. The same man she had once looked down on, the same woman she had called a toy wife, were now symbols of global respect and admiration. And Olama? She aged rapidly. Her once black hair turned gray within months. Her health began to deteriorate due to stress and constant weeping. She would sit outside her home every evening, hoping for a miracle, for Chuka to drive in, walk up to her, and say he forgave her. But that day never came. Letters she tried sending were returned. Messages she sent through church elders were ignored. One Sunday she finally broke down during service, sobbing at the altar, confessing her sins before the congregation. "I had a king under my roof and treated him like dirt," she cried. "I deserve whatever punishment I face." And while some tried to console her, others could only shake their heads. "Chuka has moved on," one woman whispered. "She taught him pain. Now life is teaching her the same." It wasn't revenge. It was justice, poetic and profound. A warning to all who mock what they don't understand and abuse what they fail to value. Despite everything that had happened, Chuka's heart remained unbroken. Not by pain, not by wealth, not even by the betrayal he had once endured. Many expected that success would change him, turn him into the arrogant kind of man who sneers at those below. But Chuka, molded in fire and forged by hunger, had a different spirit. He continued to live humbly, though now in abundance. Every month, he visited orphanages and slums, not for show but because he knew what it meant to be forgotten. He funded scholarships for children like him, those born into suffering but rich in spirit. Mimi often watched him from the doorway of their nursery, Zikora in her arms, marveling at the man he had become. "You carry the world and still have room in your heart," she once told him. "You are the man I prayed for before I even met you." One day while walking through the very stream side where he once fetched water barefoot, Chuka met a boy crying just like he once did. The boy had been accused of stealing soap and was being chased from the market. Chuka stopped them, paid for the soap, and gently knelt beside the child. "I've been here before," he said. "And I promise, this is not the end of your story." The boy looked up at him, confused. "But they said I'm nothing," he sobbed. Chuka smiled, handing him a note with his phone number. "Then prove them wrong. That act, small to many, became a headline the next day. Billionaire rescues homeless boy, the caption read. But for Chuka, it wasn't about news. It was about never forgetting. For him, wealth was not measured in naira or properties. It was in people, in compassion, in remembering. Mimi remained his constant, his strength, his laughter, his home. They celebrated their anniversary under the mango tree where it all began. With candles lit around them and their son gurgling in a nearby stroller, they held hands and gave thanks. They laughed but we lived, Chuka said. They mocked but we grew. Mimi nodded. And one day when Zikora asks why people treat others badly, we will tell him, because they don't see. But when you learn to see, really see, you begin to love. That night, they danced to no music, just the rustle of wind and the beat of two hearts that had once been broken but had healed each other. The world had laughed, yes. But in the end, love had the last word. Years passed, but the story of Chuka and Mimi remained evergreen. Their love had become more than a fairy tale. It had evolved into a movement, an anthem of resilience for people who had been mocked, abandoned, or mislabeled. The couple continued to build their legacy, not through fame or fortune, but through intentional acts of compassion. Chuka established schools in rural areas, naming the first one after his late father, the man whose death had once thrown him into the fire that forged him. He visited those schools often, speaking to students with a quiet authority and a tender voice. I used to eat from dustbins, he once told a class. But what saved me wasn't luck, it was love, belief, and the decision not to become what the world expected of me. Children listened, mouths open, their eyes wide with wonder. Some cried. Some smiled. But none left unchanged. Mimi, now a globally recognized advocate for persons with disabilities, gave TED Talks and stood before presidents, reminding them that dignity was not to be earned by perfection, but by existence. Their son, Zikora, grew up grounded. Though born into opulence, he was never allowed to forget where his roots lay. Mimi made sure of that. She often took him back to the mango tree, sat him down, and retold the story. This was where it started, she would say. Right here your father cried and I offered him a hand. They laughed at me, Ziko. But they didn't know I was the daughter of a king. Zikora, curious and thoughtful, would ask, why did they laugh, Mama? And Mimi would respond with a smile, because they didn't understand. People fear what they don't understand and they hurt what they fear. One day Zikora looked up and said, but you didn't fear Daddy. Mimi touched his face and whispered, no, I saw him. Even when he couldn't see himself yet. The boy grew up knowing that love had rescued him before he was even born. His heart held that story like a sacred scroll, not one of shame but of power. The village that once scorned them had changed too. New generations grew up hearing tales not of poverty or mockery, but of triumph. The mango tree became a symbolic sight. Pilgrims from neighboring towns came to see it, to sit under its shade and pray for their own miracles. Some carved their initials into the bark. Others tied handkerchiefs and notes of hope to its branches. A bronze statue of Chuka and Mimi was erected in the village square, not tall, not grand, but powerful. It depicted them holding hands, standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes forward. On the base was an inscription that read, they saw beyond the flesh. They loved beyond the laughter. And beneath that, in smaller letters, to those they laughed at, your day is coming. As Chuka and Mimi stood before that statue with Zikora between them, their hearts full, they knew their story had outlived the shame. They were no longer the orphan and the dwarf. They were the ones who rose. The ones who loved. The ones they laughed at, but who laughed last and longest in joy. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tales by Tochi for more.